After being stalled on Friday night when 4 Republicans voted against the One Big Beautiful Bill, the House Budget Committee advanced the measure late last night after a weekend of talks and negotiations. The bill has one more stop in the Rules Committee before advancing to the House floor for a vote, just ahead of the Memorial Day deadline set by House Speaker Mike Johnson. Here to discuss this is Congressman Ron Estes, who serves on 3 House committees, including the Budget Committee. He represents the 4th Congressional District of Kansas. Congressman Estes, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us after a long weekend.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's great to be back.
All right, so let's talk about the process. Late last night, after a weekend of negotiations, the bill passed. What concessions were made to conservatives to get this bill across the line?
Yeah, you know, this was a great next step that we took last night in the Budget Committee, moving towards passing this One Big Beautiful Bill. There's so many good components in this in terms of focusing on how do we make sure we increase funding for the defense? How do we help support with all the illegal immigration and border security here? How do we start to work on the deficit reduction, as well as making sure Americans don't get a 22% tax increase? And over the weekend, I think a lot of the work was done, particularly the discussion from most of the Budget Committee members. We're talking about how do we get more deficit reduction and focus on some of those policies, particularly some of the ones, the way the bill was originally structured in the different committees was a lot of the spending increases was up front in the first few years of the 10-year window, whereas a lot of the reductions were in the latter part of that. So a lot of the work was how do we bring some of those reductions forward as well so that we can help work and address the deficit as it stands right now.
Well, and I think that's important for people to know, because there's a lot of budget gimmicks that are used, and you can push things out, you know, to the 10-year window, the end of that 10-year window, and you're not going to have control over it. So what you can control is only what is happening in this Congress, or maybe the next Congress you'll have influence. So I think it's right for conservatives to push this up, especially in light of Moody's rating cut of the U.S. sovereign credit rating down 1 notch. I mean, they're concerned about America's continuing deficits and our big debt.
That's right, and you know, Moody's hasn't always gotten it right, but there's certainly some indications here that our spending is out of control. You look back, going back to 2019, our spending has gone up 70%, even while revenue has gone up 50%. But spending has just gotten so large at the federal government level. And you know, Moody's missed the boat earlier when they were talking about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, when they said that would not cause inflation and it would lead to a lot of jobs. And that did not happen. And so we want to make sure that as we pass the One Big Beautiful Bill, that it helps focus on how do we keep the economy going and lowers the deficit as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're right on Moody's. But I think we all can recognize that when we're carrying nearly $37 trillion in debt, and we're adding almost $2 trillion a year now at the clip that we're running at, we cannot sustain this. And so I applaud the work of conservatives on the Budget Committee and the Republicans as a whole. But there's been a lot of give and take. I was actually talking to the Speaker over the weekend, and as we accommodate the conservatives here, what's going to happen next with the moderates who are wanting an increase in the deduction for local, state and local taxes? Are they going to get a bigger deduction for that from the blue states?
Yeah, I think that is one of the difficulties as we go through this process, because there's so much good in this bill that we're looking at, and we're trying to focus on so many things. Obviously, there's lots of dynamics that affects different districts, as well as affects different senators in different states. So we want to make sure, as we're structuring the bill, that we address it and we keep moving forward with deficit reduction, as well as making sure that we don't have this huge tax increase next year.
Well, those are 2 very significant items you just brought up. Number one, the tax increase, which, if this is not passed, almost every American family that pays taxes is going to feel it. But that deficit reduction, that's one that I don't think people pay as much attention to, because we've heard it so often. It's kind of like, you know, the boy who cried wolf, and people have heard it over and over again and nothing's happened, but that doesn't mean it's not going to. I think we're reaching a point where the level of our debt that we have amassed as a nation is just unsustainable, and we're paying, you know, $1 trillion a year just on interest more than what we pay for national security. I'm wondering, has that awareness gripped the Congress to go beyond the parochial issues that you talked about? You got this program here, got this program there, got this state that wants this, but looking at this as a whole as a nation, have we reached that point yet?
I think as we've seen over the last year and a half, as the interest costs have risen from roughly $300 billion up to $1 trillion, there's a lot more visibility in Congress as well as across the country that it's an issue we have to address. Right now, as you said, interest is higher than defense spending. It's behind only Social Security and Medicare, and in the next couple of years, it's expected to pass a Medicare cost. And so one of the things we need to make sure is that even though people recognize it's a concern, we've got to be willing to actually address some of our issues and recognize that there's got to be some decisions made, even though there are provisions we may not agree with 100%. I may not agree with 100% all of the provisions that end up in there, but we're trying to make sure that we get the best solution moving forward.
And it's a combination. I think you've got to address the spending side, but you also want to increase growth. I mean, you've got to increase economic growth, which is going to create more tax revenue. And a part of that, I think, is the tax cuts, because that's going to spur on, I think, more investment, more activity. So it is a combination of doing both. And frankly, I think Congress has been a little hesitant to do the spending cuts, because once a program is created, rarely does it ever go away.
It really is. I mean, as President Reagan said, that's almost the closest thing to eternal life is a federal government program, and it's much difficult to stop those programs once they get started because they take on a constituency of their own. But we've got to make some of those tough decisions, as well as making sure that when we put policy in place, it does address those pro-growth things. Our bipartisan scorekeepers, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, tend to look at things mostly in a static view. And we recognize that we want to make sure that we incentivize businesses to grow. We want to incentivize having that economic growth, because we know with that economic growth, we'll continue to get more tax revenue. If you look back consistently over the last several decades, our tax revenue has come in about 17 to 18% of our GDP. So a growing GDP means we have more tax revenue, but our spending has now ballooned up to a roughly 24% of GDP, and that's where our problem is right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We ought to tie our spending to our GDP, so you can't have any more growth in spending than you do in economic growth, except maybe in an emergency situation, war, or something like that. Congressman Estes, just a couple minutes left here. So the bill passed last night. It now has to go to the Rules Committee. So what are the prospects there?
The next steps, as you said, are going through the Rules Committee. A couple things that are being done. There's some of the final negotiations on which provisions go in for the deficit reduction, as well as some of the tax provisions as well, and looking at how do we move some of those deficit reduction provisions forward. There's also, as we have to look at it, because of the rules in the Senate around the Byrd rule, we have to make sure that the bill that passes out of the House doesn't conflict with some of those provisions over there. So that's the step right now that's going on in terms of crafting a manager's amendment for the bill as it goes into the Rules Committee, and then it'll be passed, and we expect to have it passed and pass the floor of the House this week.
Now, Chip Roy, congressman from Texas, is on the Rules Committee. He is also a member of the Budget Committee. He voted against it. He was one of the four that voted against it on Friday night. Last night, the four Republicans just voted present, so their vote didn't count against it. Is he going to be satisfied, you think, when it comes to the Rules Committee? Will he vote for it in the Rules Committee?
Yeah, I think that's part of the process. One, over the weekend, I mean, there was a lot of time being spent as they focused on what are some of the types of issues that they could do to bring some of that deficit reduction forward. And I've talked with Chip last night and talked with some of the other members, and they're focusing on how do we make sure some of these good provisions get included. That's kind of the part of the next steps as they're working towards that manager's amendment for the Rules Committee. And I do expect that we'll get 218 votes on the House floor so that we can pass this legislation and keep it moving forward. It's too important for America not to.
Optimistic that it will be done by Memorial Day?
I am optimistic. I think it may be, Thursday or Friday this week when we get that done, and they're looking at trying to schedule a vote on Thursday.
Okay, well, I've got my schedule cleared through late Friday because sometimes I know these things come up to the wire, trying to get them across the line. Congressman Estes, I want to thank you for joining us. Always great to have you on the program.
Great, thank you.